In this video, I'm asked to answer the question, how should we teach translation? Actually, it's a complex question, and the complex question is supposed to raise a complex answer. We don't have enough time to go into detail, but I should start by this. Teaching translation depends on a lot of parameters. Teaching translation for beginners is different from teaching translation for advanced students. The way of teaching a theoretical course, for example, let's say theories of translation, is different from teaching a practical course. The way of teaching a specialized course, let's say legal translation, for example, is different from teaching a general course of translation. And actually, the way of teaching any course should be adapted according to the objectives of that particular course, commonly called CLOs, course learning outcomes. So we can say that there is no model, there is no one and unique model of teaching translation that is valid for all the types of students and all the types of courses. But let's say that it's a course for beginners. Let's say it's introduction to a translation. Usually students at this level don't have any idea what translation is. They don't even know what is the difference between translation and interpreting. They have no idea about the different types of interpreting. So personally, I use videos. I use short videos for my students to show them concretely what is consecutive interpreting, for example, compared to simultaneous interpreting, what is sight translation compared to written translation, what is conference interpreting, and so on. Things could work just like this. As for translation per se, students should have this opportunity to get in touch with some basic theoretical concepts. These concepts should be taught not for the sake of theory. They should always be related to the practice. Basic concepts such as techniques of translation, for example, text types, the context, the role of context in dealing with meaning. Because students at this level usually think that we deal with language, and we should teach them that translation deals with something else, something that is behind the words. It deals actually with meaning, not with language. So language is a must. It should be a prerequisite. So what is important is to know how to convey the meaning from point A, commonly called source text, into point B, commonly called target text. This meaning is actually being oriented and fixed not with the dictionary, not with words, but there are some extra-lingual parameters that actually orient the meaning and help the reader to understand the intention of the writer. I usually give very simple examples to my students. Let's say, the door please. Exactly the same statement containing 3 words, the door please. So I ask them, if the door is closed, the door please, what would you do? So they usually say, I will open the door. And the opposite is also true. I open the door, then I say, the door please. What I'm asking you to do now? You are asking us to close the door. So this is the best example, a very simple example to show them that actually what fixes the meaning is not the words, but some extra-lingual parameters. Let's call them context, let's call them, the intention or something else. Students are also given this opportunity to know that not all the texts are being handled or should be handled exactly in the same way. So a piece of poetry should not be translated or approached exactly as a news article. And here we introduce the very basic concepts of text types as suggested by Katharina Rice in a very simple way. When, for example, I introduced the techniques of translation as suggested almost 60 years ago by the Canadian scholars Viney and Darbelny, I also give them in a very simple way. And I give some exercises to my students, sometimes in class, in a sort of workshop. Sometimes I give them this opportunity to translate their texts elsewhere, whether at home or in the library, using all the references, the dictionaries they want. Then once in class, a couple of students or a group of 3 are in charge of presenting their translation on the blackboard. The rest of the class here, they have their own translations also, and a sort of class discussion is raised. They give their comments, they give their orientations, they give their corrections, of course under the supervision and the guidance of the instructor.
In my opinion, social semiotic multimodality needs to be integrated into translation teaching. This is because meaning making does not only involve writing, but also other modes. For instance, meaning making in audiovisual text involves image, speech, gesture, gaze, and writing. Written text comprises not only writing, but layout and typographical elements, such as capital letter, typeface, and so on. Hence, translators should be able to identify which modes and semiotic resources are regarded as effective to be used in communications by a community and society, and then reconstruct the closest meaning in the target language.
In its essence, translation is an act of communication based on the transfer of meaning from one language into another. Therefore, the first thing students should be aware of is the fact that form is variable, whereas content is invariable or is constant. This simply means that one text may invite different translations. That's because the same text may formally be rendered differently, despite the fact that the content of the translation is supposed to be the same. Of course, there are intervening variables here, depending on the type of text. The type of text would decide whether form is a priority or not. For example, in poetry, it is a priority, whereas in texts written for general purposes, it's not priority. So the focus will be on relaying the meaning independently of form. It really doesn't matter insofar as you are capturing the content of the source text. One should also be aware of the fact that there are gains and losses in translation. In fact, the term equivalence, which is frequently used by translation theorists, is a kind of metaphor because it's impossible to have equivalence between the source language text and the target language text. One should instead, in fact, talk about resemblance, translation resemblance, but for convenience, most people use the term equivalence. And this notion of equivalence is supposed to be connected with contextual factors, with context, both the macro context and the micro context. The macro context has to do with the 3 main variables: author, text, audience, and which are supposed to be placed on a triangle. At the top of the triangle, we have the author. At the base, we have both text and audience. And in the center, we should place the translator. because the translator here is a key agent. So the option for one type of equivalence rather than another is based on priorities. Should audience be given priority? In that case, domestication would be a general strategy. Should text be given first priority? In such a case, the translation or the rendering of target of source language features is a priority. In other words, foreignization here comes to the fore. It goes without saying that there are gains and losses in translation. At one juncture, we may lose. At another, we may gain. So it's a tug of war between form and content. You may not be able to capture an idiomatic expression at one juncture by communicatively interpreting the meaning, and at another juncture, you may render a source language segment into that's not idiomatic in nature into something that's idiomatic in the target language. So here it's a kind of game, a lose and win game. One important thing to note in translation activity, and which students should be aware of, is the fact that translation does not exist in pure form. This is impossible. So you cannot say that I have a 100% domesticated translation, especially if we are dealing with serious texts, authoritative texts. One has to fluctuate or maneuver between form and function. And sometimes we have ideation equivalence mediating between formal equivalence and functional equivalence. At the end of the day, translation is supposed to be a process rather than a one-stage kind of product, despite the fact that most people are interested in the product, but the product does not come from a vacuum, it comes from some process. So to me, students should be taught to look at translation as at least a three-stage process: pre-translating, translating, and post-translating, to make sure that things are in good order. So translation activity is, in fact, an advanced applied linguistics exercise. It is a multifaceted kind of exercise, which cannot be prescribed the way rules are prescribed, but rather should be looked at from different angles in order to decide priorities and make the right options.
I have taught translation for 3 years. I think translation can be taught by applying teaching techniques that consider the objective of a translation, its theoretical principles, and the creativity of students. A translation class should not include a lecture type of learning in which teachers share the knowledge. It should rather be an activity where students are taught how to use their own knowledge and skills in conducting translation activities. This can be achieved by teaching students general translation strategies and allowing them to use their initiative in applying these strategies when translating a text.
I think in these few seconds I cannot speak in details regarding teaching translation, but I might deal briefly with some wrong behaviors that I've noticed in teaching translation. Before all, I'd reiterate saying that translation is an independent discipline. That is to say, translation requires teachers and experts in translation and not in other fields to be taught. And regarding the wrong behaviors that I have started speaking about, I think many teachers of translation, and I have noticed this practice in many universities in Algeria and even outside Algeria, what they do to teach translation, they just give a text, I might say a text, sometimes a long one, sometimes a short one, and they keep students busy doing it, translating it into Arabic or English or French or any other language. Then after a while, I mean, the teacher is busy doing something else. And after a while, the teacher comes to tell them, have you finished? So they say yes, and they start giving their, each one should give his translation. That the teacher started saying, that's good, that's not good, and this is it. In the end of the day, there is absolutely no comment, no analysis, and they are saying no learning. So I want, let's say, to advise my dear colleagues not to teach translation this way. If you give a text to students, please, before requesting them or asking them to translate it, you have to go through some analysis. That is to say, you go and browse the lexical level and see, explain to them what is meant by this word, what is meant by this term likely, what is the term meant by this other term or this same term in other field, and so on. Let them, be well catered regarding the text you're giving them. And the other point, you should go into some analysis, because as all of us know that sometimes in a text there are some, let's say, we have to read between the lines, we have to explain to them that the author means this and not this, and if there is in a certain ambiguity or vagueness, we explain to them then that you might commit this mistake in this context. You have to direct the attention of the students, that they might commit these mistakes, all believing that they are translating right, but they are translating wrong. So there should be a kind of contribution of the teacher in the development of the translation. And then after that, you can, at that moment, give them the floor to start translating. It means that the students have to be, let's say, helped, assisted by the teacher before starting to translate. And even after finishing translation, and the translation, is submitted or sometimes read to the teacher has to, let's say, fulfill his duties and give them a detailed feedback. And it's detailed feedback, this one, I think, needs to be given to them in writing. It means they write the text paragraph after paragraph, and you give them detailed paragraphs. And sometimes you need as much of mistakes to enable them learning, because it's through the mistakes that they learn, not through the correct translation they provide from the very beginning, because the level of the students, as all of us know, it's not homogeneous. Some students understand from the first glance, and some others need many explanations to understand and to be able likely to translate at the very end. That's why you have to give them your feedback, and it's through mistakes that you teach them, and not through correct translations that are given from the very beginning that students might learn.
It's possible to say that there are no established systematic ways of teaching in translation. And while this might sound quite negative for the first while, we can possibly look at it from a positive perspective. This leaves the teacher or the trainer with a range of methods and teaching practices to choose from, to choose what suits his classes and his or her students. For me, there are a number of principles that I try to stick to in teaching translation. The first thing is that I try to diversify tasks in my classes and try to ask students to do different things in different classes. They can, for example, translate from scratch. They can edit machine translation. They can compare different versions of the same source text. and even the traditional teaching approach in translation, that is abbreviated in WTNS, what the next sentence is, in which students translate a sentence and then they discuss it and look for other possible translations, and then they move to the next sentence. Even this traditional approach, I do apply it in my classes as a way or a kind of change. It is important to apply this method because you make your students eager for the next class and feel that they cannot expect what the next class would be like. The second thing is to make your classes student-centered and to give more role to your students and to limit your role to that of the supervisor and the facilitator, to increase the self-confidence of students and to make them lifelong learners. Also, since translation is mainly a skill, I try to adopt project-based learning or problem-solving approaches. And in my courses, I try to assign different projects to my students, projects relevant, of course, to the nature of the course. And recently, I have been doing Wikipedia translation projects with my students, and they proved to be so interesting and so practical, and they helped students a lot, and they exposed them to the real underpinnings of translation as a profession. Finally, there is something very important that I do with my students. I try to listen to them and get feedback on different teaching practices and approaches, and to know what they like and they didn't like about them, how to improve them. And I got really very interesting feedback. And my advice for all teachers and trainers is never to underestimate your students. At the end, believe me that you are going to discover that you learn from your students more than they learn from you.
My contribution to this series of recordings on translation is a simple question. What makes a good translator? I would like to start by referring to a wide misunderstanding about the profession of translation, which is usually associated with bilingualism. For many people, especially the layman, it is believed that knowing 2 languages or more, a competent knowledge, a thorough knowledge of 2 languages or more, which is technically known as bilingualism, is enough for someone to be a competent translator or an outstanding translator. Unfortunately, this is not the whole story, and this is not enough. Of course, knowing being aware of the language rules or the language theories and all theories and theoretical postulations in the field of in linguistic fields like sociolinguistics, psycholinguistics, discourse analysis, etc., is a requirement. Actually, is a very basic requirement for someone to be a translator, to be a good translator, to be an outstanding translator. Just like an engineer, a mechanical engineer, in order for someone to be a competent or skilled engineer, he should have mastery of all rules and regulations and theories of engineering or related to mechanics and so on. The same applies to translation. It is an inevitable requirement for someone to be a translator. He or she should have this thorough knowledge of the 2 languages that he works on, the source language and the target language. But unfortunately, this is not enough. There is something else that someone needs in order to be a good translator or outstanding translator, and that is the sense of art. similar to music, similar to painting or drawing. It's not enough for someone to read about music or about painting and schools of painting and painters and so on. This does not make someone a painter. He or she should have a sense of art, something else which we call this sense of art or creativity beside this kind of knowledge. So for someone to be an outstanding translator, especially those who work in literary fields like poetry or poetic language, novels, short stories, and even scientific text, the sense of art, the creativity is inevitable requirement for someone to be an outstanding translator and for the translation to be a distinguished product. In this regard, it might be useful to refer you to a recently published book by Dr. Ali Al-Manna, translator as a photographer. This is, at a glance, this is a very clear indication that linguistic knowledge alone does not make someone an outstanding or good translator. There is something else that we call the sense of art, the imagination, in order to manipulate, in order to deal with the various aspects of translation, not only the linguistic aspects of this activity, but something else, because translation does not include purely linguistic issues. It's really far beyond these limits, and this might be discussed later on.
In fact, I have been teaching the module of translation for more than 10 years at the English department at the Faculty of Humanities in the same university. So teaching this module for as I said, for a long time has made me familiar with the different difficulties and problems that students face while taking this course. So my approach to the teaching of this module is to include a dose of theory, so that students can approach the translation process not as a mechanical operation whereby they replace words or they look up for words in bilingual dictionaries and they replace them by their counterpart, but it is something more than that. So throughout my experience of teaching translation and discussing the different problems that students face with other colleagues from the same department or other departments, other English departments in Moroccan universities, we have noticed that students face these problems because of some reasons. First, students do not grasp or do not understand the meaning in the source text. So what is and mostly in the foreign language. So what is obscure in the source text is going to be more obscure and ambiguous in the target language. The second reason is that sometimes students understand the text, but they do not have the they are unable to reproduce that meaning in the target language because they are not familiar with the language tools and mechanisms, or because they translate word for word, and we know that literal translation does not give that communicative impact or communicative effect or the referential and pragmatic equivalence to the target text. So as I said, one of or part of the problems part of the translation problems is lies in the fact that students consider translation as a mechanical problem. So as a mechanical process. So what we do, or what I do in my translation course, the first day I meet my students, is that I try to make them know and make them familiar with the process of translation. Okay, the first thing I do in my course of translation is that I give them a background of translation, okay, the different definitions of translation, teach them the different aspects they need to consider when they are translating, and also teach them the difference between the translation as a process and then the product. So we look the first class in my translation class is that we look at the different aspects that students need to look at when they are translating. They need to know that languages do not express the same thoughts in the same way, so they might correspond or they might match, but not always. They occasionally match, as Mona Baker mentions that in most of her research. So I try to make students believe that translation is a mental process, is a cognitive process, and is a process that takes problem solving and decision making. So they have, sometimes when they are translating a word or a sentence or a text, they have many options and they have to decide, they have to solve that problem, okay, they are facing. When they solve the problem, if they have many options to choose from, they need to know, they need to make the decision of choosing the best option that fits that text, and then try to look at the context of the text. So when we look at these aspects, I try to go through with my students through the syntactic problems that they might face, the semantic problems, the pragmatic problems. So when we do syntactic problems, of course, we look at sentence construction, at tenses, at modifiers. If they are in English, they are pre-modifiers, and in Arabic they are not. Articles, the passive voice and the active voice that Arabic uses.
Actually, in this short video, I'm going to talk about teaching translation. Is it enough for you to be a professional translator in order to be a good teacher of translation? I think this is not enough. You should be fully aware of the problem that a student might face while translating. From the very beginning, a student should know the linguistic aspects of the English language and the Arabic language in order to be fully aware of the process of translation. So the differences between English and Arabic as two different languages from different families should be in the mind of the teacher and the student. The main problems that are faced by the students are at different levels. So while we are teaching the students linguistics, we should always remind them of these problems in translation. For example, the syntactic and grammatical problems. For example, if I say الأسود حيوانات متوحشة, when I translate this into English, I would say lions are wild animals, not the lions. Although the definite article is found in both English and Arabic, but its uses are different actually. At the semantic level, you might face some problems like the metaphorical structures and how to convey the metaphorical structures. This may be also stylistic level as well. For example, if I say لها وجه مشرق يبدد غيوم الياس, if I translate it into she has a very beautiful face and just say this is the intended meaning, so here I lost the aesthetics of the metaphor or the metaphorical meaning. So I should search for a suitable metaphor in the English language in order to communicate this. So I can say she has a shining face that disperses the clouds of despair. Here I kept the metaphorical meaning and the intended meaning of the speaker. The pragmatic meaning means what the speaker intends to say, what is intended by the speaker. Sometimes what is intended by the speaker is different from what is said because of something like irony, punning. So when you find some mistake, some problems in making compromise between the intended meaning and the literal meaning. So you should try to avoid the literal meaning and to try to find the pragmatic or the intended meaning. For example, in the Holy Quran, ذُقْ إنك أنت العزيز الكريم. Of course, the meaning here of Al-Aziz Al-Karim is used ironically in order to show great humiliation for the listener. So actually we should convey the ironical meaning, okay, in order to convey this sense of humiliation in the English language. Okay, so you are a noble one. Okay, I should convey the same meaning, the same ironical meaning. Okay, because this is intended also. This is part of the intended meaning.
The students in this college are given 2 hours a week literary translation. Students are given a general background on the characteristics of literary translation, the language of literature, and the nature of various literary genres. Different approaches and methods of translation are also explained to them. As part of the translation practice, which takes most of the time, students are exposed to various literary texts chosen from novels, short stories, and plays. Poetry is touched upon due to its complexity. The translation emphasis is more on English into Arabic, which takes about 60%, and Arabic into English, which takes about 40%. The unseen text concerned, usually 1 page long, is given to the students in the classroom. They work in groups of 3 to 4 students. They can use dictionaries to get the meanings of difficult words, and they are given 30 minutes to discuss amongst themselves the translation process. A number of students are then asked to read their translations in the classroom, and other students can participate, comment, raise questions, and suggest any modifications. Some sort of critical thinking is exercised during discussions. Students are always told that literary translation is a sophisticated activity and not an easy one, as some of them might think. In fact, I have 2 aims in teaching literary translation to such advanced level students. First, the translation process encompasses a linguistic transference. By this I mean they can make use of the high language used by distinguished men of letters. And 2, literary translation is by itself a creative process. Students are always advised to pay due attention to the flavor of the literary text and the artistic features of the language of literature, including figurative language, rhythm, rhyme, tone, connotative meanings, etc. They are also encouraged not to translate literally. Rather, they are prompted to practice free translation, taking into account that their translations should be loyal to the original text. Finally, challenging spots of literary translation are explained to them.
Well, in my translation class, I always tell my students that they are specialized in translation. They are professionals. They are not only bilinguals. So when they translate, I always encourage them to link what they actually do with translation theories and approaches. So I teach them and ask them to use the appropriate translation methodology framework. And as we all know, that this translation framework consists of 3 basic steps. Step 1, pre-translating step, which is the source text comprehension, which comprises source text analysis, doing both macro analysis and micro analysis. Some scholars call them intratextual analysis and extratextual analysis. So while doing this, they can seek help, or they are encouraged to use documentary sources like dictionaries, encyclopedias, consult people, specialists, or whatsoever. Then they move to the step 2, which is the actual act of translating. That's the translation or the target text production. Of course, while they are translating and doing the actual act of translation, they have to use appropriate translation strategies and techniques in order to transfer the source language units into the target language. Then they move to the 3rd step, or step 3, which is the post-translating step. That's the translation revision. So when they complete translating any text, they have to revise it in order to get rid of any typos or grammatical or stylistic problems. Of course, comparing the meaning of the translated text to that of the source text. While doing so, they need to make appropriate decisions. They need to know what they are doing, and they need to justify the decisions they make. So by doing all of this professionally, they would be able to translate any text, no matter what its type is. They would be also to translate both directions, English into Arabic and Arabic into English in our case, and would be able to deal with any translation problem, whether it is cultural or linguistic, and overcome those problems. So overall, doing this professionally would of course enable them to produce well-translated texts, and that's our objective.
To know how to teach translation, translation teachers have to be acquainted with the process of course design. According to my PhD study in developing translation courses, the findings indicate that there is a lack of well-designed translation courses on the teacher's part, which has affected the successfulness of these courses at university level. As a translation teacher, you may be wondering, what is course design and why is it so important to you? Well, course design involves planning for students' learning, since this is always important regardless instructions or format. So before designing a translation course, teachers have to identify their objectives for creating and teaching this course. Then they have to think of what kind of knowledge and skills they intend to provide their students. These should be based on the social and situational context, including mission and vision of the department, the level of specialization, the duration of the course, the market needs, and the students' needs. Based on these elements, teachers can go through the steps of designing a translation course. The first step is formulating learning outcomes. Learning outcomes identify the knowledge and skills that the students will acquire by the end of the course. To create effective outcomes, It is important to align them with activities, assignments, and assessments. The second step is determining content and material. Selecting content and material depends on how much they can achieve the aims and objectives of the translation course, the market needs, and the students' needs. Based on these elements, translation teachers have to think of: number one, what are the main topics that will be covered? Number two, what text type is useful for the context of the translation course? Number three, the amount of theory and practice that will be covered in the translation course. Number four, the type of material that is useful for the students, whether it's created material or authentic material, or both of them. The third step is designing activities and assignments. It's necessary for translation teachers to pick activities and assignments that allow students to meet learning outcomes. In student-centered environment, students are the doers of activities, assignments, and projects, while teachers can work as a guide or counselor, not providing students with direct answers, but encouraging discussion, negotiating, and teamwork. The fourth step is assessment and evaluation. Assessments are ongoing evaluation process which enrich the achievements of learning outcomes. It's important for teachers to think of what type of assessment is more useful: formative assessment or summative assessment. In translation courses, it's preferred to give more weight for formative assessment, since it's useful for both teachers and students. Here, it's necessary to design a grading rubric for students to provide them with formative feedback and assess their work easily. In addition, planning for summative assessment that is used at the end of a teaching unit, semester, or course can provide evidence for decision making. In brief, careful planning makes translation teaching easier and more enjoyable.
First, we can starting by the equivalency between Arabic and Javanese translation. And in the second step, we can do to elaborate about the loss and gain, maybe a loss and meaning and gain in meaning. This is the research from translation studies, especially using the data Arabic and Javanese. And also we can study about and elaborate about the shifting of form and meaning between Arabic and Javanese. After that, we can use the analysis of micro and macro analysis in translation. Micro translation or micro analysis, we can use theory about technique translation, also strategy in translation, and also the procedure of translation. And for macro theory, we can elaborate the translation from the method using the V diagram from Newmark, and also the ideology of translation with late between two polars, they have Voronization and domestication. And the last, we can elaborate the translation study from the quality of translation, the accuracy of translation, the readability of translation, the acceptable of translation. Also, we can study from the quality of translation. The last, the orientation of translation studies, we can elaborate Arabic Javanese from product-oriented, also process-oriented, also maybe the participant-oriented, and the last, maybe the contact-oriented.
Today, I would like to talk about the importance of assessment in the context of teaching translation. My advice to teachers is that prior to the process of teaching translation, they need to make diagnostic assessment of their students' performance in both the English language and translation in order to identify their students' strengths and weaknesses, as well as their needs. On the basis of this diagnostic assessment, the teacher can determine the objectives and the expected course outcomes, as well as choose course content and teaching method to realize these objectives and outcomes. In order to make the translation course a successful one, the teacher needs also to undertake formative assessment, which represents ongoing assessment. It should be in the form of explicit criteria and description of performance levels. This type of assessment provides continuous feedback to the teacher and the students alike. As far as the teacher is concerned, it helps monitor students' progress towards course objectives and learning outcomes. It also helps to indicate more scrupulously students' needs as the course progresses. It further helps proper adjustment of teaching method on the basis of data driven from assignments. It is also useful in grading because it controls subjectivity and it is objective to a great extent. As far as the students are concerned, it enhances their motivation, engagement, and performance. The bottom line is that it puts the teacher and the students on the same page and bridges the gap between the teacher and his or her students.
In teaching this branch of audiovisual translation, namely subtitling, we introduce our students to subtitles as a form of intersemiotic communication and interlinguistic mediation. Students should be aware of the various semiotic channels of communication, and they should be able to successfully render the content of the original material in their final products. We also make sure that our students are acquainted with the constraints and the international norms of subtitling. They should be aware of the spatial and temporal constraints of the medium. These include the number of characters, the duration of the subtitles, segmentation, synchronization, and so on. We also make sure that our students are exposed to a variety of audiovisual material relating to different genres, including feature films, documentaries, sitcoms, drama, and so on. And as you know, each genre poses a certain set of problems that subtitlers have to deal with, and they should be able to identify the most appropriate strategies to tackle such problematic issues. We also encourage our students to map the subtitling conventions that are in use in the region by observing a number of satellite channels, online streaming channels, DVDs, and so on. This would give them a complete picture of what is happening in the industry and identify the most commonly used conventions of subtitling by subtitling companies and individual subtitlers. Finally, we make sure that our students are aware of a very important point, namely equality in subtitling, internationally and in the Arab world, by concentrating on accuracy of meaning, a proper segmentation, a proper use of punctuation marks and the grammar, and so on.
Actually, I do believe that in teaching translation, in particular practical translation, the focus of attention should be shifted towards students rather than teachers. Our students should be given more power, should be given more choices. That should be a big part in our class. We need to encourage our students to get involved in our class, to participate in our class, while the teacher should step back to act as a coach, as a monitor, as a guide in the site rather than a siege in the stage. But the question that might be raised here, how can we encourage them to get involved in our class? Actually, this can be achieved by having a class characterized by choices and enjoyment. in addition to creativity, critical thinking, collaboration, communication, problem solving, and the use of technology. If you divide your own class into smaller groups, let's say groups of 3 or 4, and then you ask them to translate the text that they have already selected, this is the first choice. And you ask them to join the group that they want to join, this is the second choice. And then you ask them to decide on the role that they want to play, because you're going to ask one of them to translate the text, to act as a translator. You're going to ask the second one to revise the text, to act as a reviser. And you're going to ask the third one to edit the text, to act as an editor. So you have a lot of roles. So if you ask them to decide on the role that they want to play, they enjoy it. This is the third choice. Of course, you cannot let them decide on the role that they want to play every lecture, every class, because they prefer to work on the draft produced by somebody. They don't like to translate. They like to revise. They like to edit. And also you cannot ask them to translate the text that they have already selected every class, but from time to time. Our students should be given more choices. More choices will lead to enjoyment. So choices and enjoyment, they will love your class. They will not miss your class. Now, before getting involved in the actual act of translating, you need to step forward as a teacher to encourage them to analyze the text from different perspectives, syntactically, semantically, pragmatically, and stylistically. You need to encourage them to team up while analyzing the text at hand. Here, we're going to have collaboration that requires communication. So in order to collaborate, in order to discuss, in order to analyze the text from different perspectives, they have to communicate. So what you have here, we have communication, collaboration, and this is the first stage in the process of translation, which is called pre-translation. And all techniques in that stage, okay, are critical thinking based activities. So when you finish your own translation, pass it on to your own classmate to act as a reviser, meaning that he or she will concentrate on issues such as accuracy, addition, omission, by having access to the source text. And then when you finish your revision, please pass it on to your classmate to act as an editor without having access to the source text, but he or she will concentrate on issues such as readability, acceptability that feed into naturalness. He or she will concentrate on language, the language itself, on stylistic issues. Done? Please team up again to finalize the final version. Here again we have collaboration that requires communication. Here, this is the third stage, which is called post-translation. So all activities conducted in that stage are critical thinking based activities. When they finish, and then you can divide your own whiteboard into, let's say, 3 parts, 4 parts, 5 parts, depending on the size of the whiteboard. And then you ask the representatives of some of those groups to write their own translation on the whiteboard. You see here, you can step forward as a teacher to discuss with your own students their own translations from different perspectives. You can discuss with them examples of addition and omission. You can discuss with them the accuracy of translation. You can discuss with them the readability and acceptability of the target text. You can discuss with them the differences between the two languages, between the two cultures. You can discuss with them culture-specific terms, if any. You can discuss with them the denotative meaning of a certain word and how its denotative meaning is wider and less specific than its counterpart in the target language. You can discuss some structures. You can invite them to change, for example, the finite clause to non-finite clause without changing the meaning. You need to encourage them to get involved in the class.